Good afternoon, Detachment 842. My name is Cadet Paul, and today we have a very special guest with us. This is retired Lieutenant General Rock. Obviously, many of you probably haven't had the opportunity to look over his bio, but his final assignment before he retired was as the IG of the Air Force. So we're going to go over a bit of his history. He is an alumni of UTSA, not of Detachment 842, which we'll definitely hit on a little bit today. But we're very excited to have you here.
Thanks. I really appreciate it, Cadet Paul. Very excited to be here back at UTSA. It's ironic, but this spring will be the 40th anniversary of my graduation in 1982. It's hard to believe 4 decades have gone by, so I would say to you and anybody who's watching, don't blink, because 4 decades goes by just like that.
Yes, sir. I believe it. So right off the bat, we'll start with the little statement that we went with earlier, and that is, you are an alumni of UTSA,
Right.
not of Detachment 842. Now, my understanding of how our ROTC program worked back then is we were Det 840A for a while, part of Texas State, and then before that, maybe we didn't even exist as a detachment at all. So could you tell us a little bit about your story to commissioning? You know, what was your journey? Why did you decide to commission? And why did you decide to go to UTSA, your history major?
Sure.
You know, all of these things that let us get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, you bet. So it took me 5 years to go through school because I was not in a hurry, and I was putting myself through trying to not end up with a lot of college, loan debt. Although I did walk away with a little bit, but in my time it was single-digit numbers of thousands, not tens of thousands, or God forbid, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I am a native of San Antonio. I went to Churchill High School when it was the last thing on Blanco Road. There was nothing outside of Churchill. It was kind of out in the country. Graduated in 1977. Entered UTSA in 1977 as well, in the summer of 1977. I'd initially enrolled at Texas State. Then it was Southwest Texas State University. I made a late decision to stay local in San Antonio. It was more of an economic decision because I was able to live with my dad for the first year before I kind of went out on my own. So even then, finances drove decisions, right? And the pragmatic reality of all that. So I entered UTSA. I entered actually in the business school, and I can remember going through, I enjoyed business principles. I didn't really enjoy math, so the accounting side, and then there was this thing called computer science, which was fairly new. And I remember taking a couple of courses that chased me out of the business school. That was Fortran and COBOL programming, and it just drove me crazy. And I thought, if this is what the business school is about, I'm not really interested. So I transitioned over to the history side. I joined a fraternity. At the time, there were 3 fraternities, 4 sororities, no dormitories, about 10,000 students, and 1 ice house. UTSA's grown. I know now we're over 30,000 students. The ice house is still there, Hill and Dales. There are dormitories here. There is, I think, a fairly robust Greek program here as well. But I did join a fraternity, Tau Kappa Epsilon. I was president of my fraternity the last 2 years, and I was fairly blind to any ROTC opportunities. I don't think, as you said, you know the history better than I do, but I don't remember ROTC being an option at UTSA. It probably was through a sister school as a extended detachment. But for me, I was focused on my social life, quite frankly, in the fraternity, finishing school. When I left the business school, I went to history because it's something I've always enjoyed. My father, in fact, after 20 years as an Army Master Sergeant, retiring as an Army Master Sergeant in 1969, he had gotten his degree, so he was kind of ahead of his time. He actually had his degree, was working on his master's in 1969 when he retired as an E8. Well, in the military system, that was unheard of. He entered employment as a history teacher at MacArthur High School in Northeast School District in San Antonio. And so he probably imbued in me, maybe subliminally, a love for history. And so that's why I entered the history program. How I got into the Air Force is an interesting story. I was getting my degree in history, trying to figure out what am I going to do with a history degree if I don't want to be a history teacher, although that was an option. And I happened to wander into an Air Force recruiter's office. I was not a military brat, but my dad had been in the Army and retired when I was 10 years old. So I didn't move around a lot. I had some exposure to the military, but not a lot. Living in San Antonio, I had gone to several air shows, and I really liked the idea of flight. And so I wandered in, I think it was probably summer of 1981, about a year before I graduated, talked to a recruiter and said, "What's this Air Force thing about?" And he said, "Well, why don't you take the Air Force officer qualification test, and we'll figure out if you're, first of all, if presuming you get your degree, we'll figure out if you have, some opportunity to join." I took it. I did fairly well. He called me back and said, "You scored really well in the aviation portion. We're looking for pilot candidates. How'd you like to be a pilot in the U.S. Air Force?" So I'm going to wrap up here because it was a long journey. But in 1982, in May of 1982, I graduated from UTSA with a history degree, a low GPA, no flight time, and no prior service, and the Air Force let me go fly airplanes. Those were the Reagan build-up years. We had come down through Vietnam. We were building back up our forces in the early 1980s. I say that to say this. I'm not being falsely humble when I say I could not get into today's Air Force. Y'all are so much better as entrants to our Air Force officer corps and our enlisted men and women as well than I was. I had a 2.65 GPA when I graduated. I brought it up to a 2.65 by making the dean's list the last 2 semesters. That's how bad we needed people in the 1980s. No technical degree, no pilot's license, no flight time to speak of, a low GPA from a state school, and the Air Force said, "Tony, why don't you come in and here's an opportunity to be an officer, to learn how to fly, and we'll see where this adventure goes." Really long answer to a short question, but sorry.
No, not at all. So since we're going into your career as a pilot, right? We'll start off with questions about UPT.
Sure.
And my understanding of UPT now is that there's 3 different phases.
Right.
Was there any particular portion of UPT undergraduate pilot training that you particularly struggled with, or a specific skill set that took you a lot of time to develop while you were going through UPT?
Yeah, you're exactly right. In Pilot Training Next, what the 19th Air Force under Air Education and Training Command is doing to advance our pilot training, accelerate pilot training, compress pilot training, using a lot of technology like virtual reality, augmented reality, the ability to study on your own terms on laptops instead of having books and having to go to a class. You can get ahead. They can tailor pilot training now to entrants that have a lot more flight time. Will take a different path to wings than someone who, like me, came in with very little or no flying experience. It's, again, ironic. Just this Tuesday, I was in Pueblo, Colorado at the first phase of pilot training, which is the initial flight training program, that for our entrants that don't have a pilot's license, they have to go through IFT, initial flight training in Pueblo. They solo, it's a very structured military course. It's a squadron structure. The flight training is everything from emergency procedures training to simulators, to ground academics, to flight training, to a solo in the airplane. So it is effectively preparing them, conditioning them for their next stage, which is the primary phase of UPT, undergraduate pilot training. So it's exciting to see the evolution. To your question of what did I struggle with, again, the irony here is lost on nobody. I went through what was called the Flight Screening Program Officer Trainee Program. When OTS, Officer Training School, was in San Antonio, if you came in and you were going to go to OTS, but you didn't have a pilot's license, you had to go for the first month through the FSP, Flight Screening Program, right? You were there at Medina Annex across from Lackland Air Force Base. You had to prove that you were going to be able to go through pilot training and have a high probability of completing it. I actually failed my check ride for one item in that program. I had to go out the next day and take what was called a death ride. You pass it, great. You're going to go on to OTS and then on to UPT. You fail it, we're going to promote you below the zone to civilian, right back to civilian. You're no longer a cadet. Thanks for your time. It's good that we've been together for 30 days, but you're going to be a great manager at some retail store someday, maybe. So that was my first introduction to, holy cow, this can all end pretty quickly with a bad ride, right? And it was just a bad decision I made on a visual reference coming home. I picked the wrong reference, followed the wrong road. It was an unsatisfactory on the check ride. I overcame that. I passed the next day, went on to undergraduate pilot training, and I did fine. I really enjoyed the environment, but it's a high-stress environment, knowing that in undergraduate pilot training, you're only about 3 rides away from getting promoted below the zone to civilian and being back on the streets. So on any given day or week, you could have a set of conditions where your future changes. For me, at Hondo, Texas, in the flight screening program 40 years ago, because it was the summer of 1982, I failed a ride. I was one ride away from not ever being an Air Force officer. For whatever reason, things played out, and they seem to have worked out okay. But the point is, you have to be resilient, right? So yes, I faced some challenges both in my initial flight screening and through UPT, undergraduate pilot training for that year. It's a high-stress year, but it's also incredibly rewarding, and it's where you first learn to bond with your peers and understand that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together, and that the class working together could have a much better outcome than you could individually.
Mm. So a lot of the cadets who probably also haven't read your bio don't know that you've had a long history over the course of your career with UPT, not just as a student, but also as an instructor. Can you give us a little bit of insight about what are the characteristics of students going through UPT that make them excel, that make them accelerate through the program quickly, that particularly make them stand out from their peers? Right.
Well, the first part is the things that draw you into the U.S. Air Force, whether you're enlisted or whether you're an officer. And when I say this, I'm generalizing. You can't say all entrants, but the majority of the entrants, the thing that draws them into our world are the things that are going to make them successful, right? A high performer, focused on achievement, biased to action, willing to work together as a team and understand that the team is much more important than the individual. Be willing to own your mistakes and be willing to celebrate your wins, but then realize it's right back to work. All these things are important at every level within our Air Force, and frankly, not just vertically as you go up the chain of promotion, but broadly across all of our Air Force service codes, right? All the AFSCs out there, what makes somebody successful? Well, it's the same thing that makes somebody successful in undergraduate pilot training. It's being committed and biased to action, biased to self-improvement, being intellectually curious, never being satisfied that that was good enough. Tomorrow is an opportunity to do better than you did today. Understanding that not every tomorrow is as good as today. Some of them turn out worse, but being resilient and having the ability to bounce back. Being coachable, being teachable, because whether it's undergraduate pilot training or the world I eventually went to, which is tactical aviation, you better put on your thick skin, because we're going to sit down at the end of a flight or at the end of a shift if you're a force protector, right? Or if you're getting inspected or audited as a finance officer, you better have thick skin, because someone's going to find your weak spots, find the chinks in your armor, and they're going to tell you this is a blind spot, this is a weak spot, this is how you get better. Because that's the other part is, every one of us, while we're working and striving for self-improvement, every one of us is an instructor pilot too. Every one of us is an instructor and a Stanival and an IG inspector in our hearts. We are looking at how to make our enterprise better. Yes, we want to make ourselves individually better, but we're just part of that bigger, broader enterprise. So how do we make the enterprise better? And I find myself, even now, as Mr. Rock, no longer General Rock, I find myself looking at how an organization could do better. Quick example. I went to Colorado Springs. I was going to drive to Pueblo. I rent a car. I go out to the car. It's got a low tire pressure warning. I walk back in and tell the agent, it's got a low tire pressure warning. Can I either get the tires filled up or can I get a different car? And she says, oh, that happens all the time, right? So I gave her the feedback, because I believe every organization should fight for feedback and crave feedback and be a learning organization. And I said, so here's a recommendation as a customer. You should you should tell every customer who checks out, you might see this. It's normal due to altitude and temperature changes. It'll be fine. And then the customer doesn't have to walk back in. Her response was, well, it doesn't happen all the time. And in my mind, I'm thinking, you're not hearing me. I'm trying to give you a quality improvement, continuous improvement opportunity, and you're not taking advantage of that. Now, where did that come from? It came from years of being an Air Force officer and eventually an Air Force leader, to see problems and not just ignore them, but to fix them. And the same thing is true in UPT. Do you see your problems? Do you listen to others when they call you out on your problems? Put on your thick skin, right? And then do you actually work to do something? What do you do tomorrow that makes the problem you had today irrelevant, right? It's great. It's in the past. So So those are just a few things, but again, that's not exclusive to pilot training. That's true in everything we do as members of the Air Force, either officer or enlisted.
Mm-hmm. So, sir, can you tell us a little bit about the reason why you ultimately decided to become an instructor pilot?
Sure. So the pilot training assignment process in the 1980s was very simple. If you were in the top 10% of the graduates in the class, you were going to get your first choice, as long as that airplane was available in the drop that came to your class. The next 20%, you were going to be what was called a first assignment instructor pilot, right? We want you, you're doing well, you're above what was then called the fighter attack reconnaissance line, which was a line that was drawn in the class and said, these graduates can and should go to fighter attack and reconnaissance aircraft, these aircraft should go to TTB or tanker transport bomber. Fair or not, right or not, that's how the process was. So I was in the heart of the envelope in that next 20%. I wasn't in the top 10% of graduates. I had actually failed my formation check in T-38s, which is the 5th of 6 check rides you take, and it was, again, a single item. It was a safety of flight issue, something I didn't do right, and we can talk about that later if you want. But the point is, I had a busted check ride, which a lot of people in the class did, but the people in the top 10% didn't. So I was in that heart of the envelope, and I knew I was going to get to be a FAPE, a first assignment instructor pilot, and that's okay because you do about 3 years of that, and then they send you to a gray jet or a tactical aircraft. Either at the time it was C-141s and C-130s and B-52s and F-15s and F-16s and F-4s when we still had them, and A-10s and F-111s because it was 40 years ago, right? So in that 20%, I chose the platform. I volunteered to be a T-37 primary jet instructor rather than wait and see whether they put me in T-37s or T-38s. I just volunteered for T-37s because I wanted to teach young lieutenants with no wings on their chest how to fly airplanes. The T-38 guys and gals, and there was a mix even then of some male and female instructors, men and women. In the T-38 squadron, I perceived that they were taking a pilot who the Air Force had already taught the first 6 months, and they were teaching them to fly a new airplane, even though they didn't yet have wings. It was advancing the foundation that had already been learned. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be in that foundational educational training portion of T-37's primary jet training to take someone who couldn't spell airplane on day one of UPT and watch them solo, and watch them go solo in formation, and watch them go through 5 months of literally not being able to spell airplane to being a T-37 graduate, moving then on to T-38s.
So I was actually going to ask you this question a little later in the interview as it applied to cadet life, but it seems like it's also appropriate to ask here.
Sure.
Having had the experience of being an instructor pilot, I'm sure you've experienced, witnessed, seen, and observed a lot of different methods that help your students retain and learn information.
Sure.
What are those different strategies that maybe we could try and implement as students, as cadets, that we could take away from your experience at UPT that might help us retain and learn information?
So a couple of things come to mind. Number one is repetition, right? The reason that we had cockpit mock-ups in our flight room, training room in T-37s was so students could go through the checklist, and they would go through and they would flip switches on a dead cockpit effectively, but that's high fidelity training in the 1980s, right? It's not high fidelity training today. Now you've got Oculus and you can actually touch all the switches in a virtual reality, which is awesome. I mean, it's just it's another model for the training that we delivered in the 1980s, right? So repetition, and what you're doing is you're teaching muscle memory. You're teaching that in this part of the checklist, your hand goes here, it flips this switch. And when you get to the airplane, then it all feels very natural. When you've got all this anxiety, if I'm going to go fly and it's hot, and I'm sweating, and I'm on a flight line in August of 1983 or 82, and it's a hostile environment, right? But you have the foundation, you have the base of repetition of having done it enough times. And from that, then you go to the simulator. Right, so it's building block approaches, part task training, understanding that on day one of training, what you're dealing with as a student, and now I'm talking about you as a cadet, bringing the cadets up underneath you, right, because you're part of the instructional cadre too. But how do you take that person and wrap your mind around the fact that while you're at a certain level, they're not there because they're on day one, and you too were on day one once, right? So you have to be a little patient. So that's part of it. The other thing I would say, a great instructional technique is during a debrief. You get to a certain part of the debrief and you stop and you say, so what did you do here? What mistake did you make, right? And you see if the student knows what they did wrong, and you try to draw them out. It'll do a couple of things. Number one, it'll give you as the instructor the ability to assess their cognizance, their deep understanding of what happened and why. Number two, if they can articulate what they did and why it was wrong, then actually that is a better learning event for them because they're actually actualizing it and they're actually internalizing it, right? So those are a couple of techniques that you can apply to both flight training and classroom education. Understanding that training is different than education, right? Training is preparing for the known. Education is preparing for the unknown, right? Education tends to be deeper in the intellectual side. Training tends to be deeper in the mechanical and the performance side, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit towards more general officer sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a question I have for you is, you didn't join the Air Force with the original intent to become a general officer, but at some point in your career you must have decided that you wanted to take your career as far as possible. At what point in your career, maybe a specific pay grade or after a specific experience, did you decide this is what I want to do for the rest of my career?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We all hit inflection points, right? And those inflection points are affected by a lot of things. What have you done tactically and how have you become credible as an operator? What have you done in your career as a staff officer? What command opportunities often follow staff positions, right? And then that becomes kind of the why in the road, right? After that 05 level of command, what are we going to do? And I say we because not everybody, but in my case, I had a family, right? And they were with me on this journey. So what I just described were inflection points in the professional progression, right? Overlaid on that is the more important priority. And a lot of folks, we get fiercely and fanatically, not just fiercely, but fanatically devoted to our professional life and our organization. We forget to be as fiercely committed to the overlaying part, which is our family life, and the rest of for those of us who are blessed to have families that come along with us on the journey. So what you also have to overlay is on that career, and nobody can start on day one and say a 20-year career or a 35-year career looks like this and lay out the template, right? Now I can overlay the template of how old my children are going to be, when my spouse is going to be angry about moving, what are his or her, my spouse's professional pivots and what are their inflection points. I'm going to overlay all that and I'm going to engineer success. It doesn't work that way, right? You can generally say, about this time I would probably be out of the cockpit and onto the staff. About this time I would have a command opportunity. Okay, so one of the things I learned to say in Pakistan all the time was man plans and God laughs. Right? You can have your plan, but there is sometimes you lose control of your plan. In fact, you almost always lose control of your plan and you have to adapt. So for me, I have a wife who's been with me this summer, will be 40 years. I have 3 adult children. The youngest is my daughter, who is 32. The oldest is my son, who's 38. I think I've got that right. I may have lost a year in there. And then the one in the middle is a Black Hawk helicopter pilot. So the outriggers, my oldest and my youngest, work in technology. My daughter, I'll use her as an example. I moved her 4 times in high school. Every single summer of high school, I was given a great professional opportunity, a developmental opportunity. Well, guess what? When you're told this is your next step professionally, and it's good for you, and look what it could potentially lead to, that may be great for you professionally, but quite often it's wholly unfulfilling to your hormonal teenage daughter, right? Who's got a different set of priorities and challenges. And I say daughter because that was my experience, but it's true with all children, right? Your children need stability, especially in their high school years. The Air Force doesn't always offer you that. The Space Force doesn't always offer you that, right? As you accelerate, you have more opportunities professionally. Sometimes that comes in direct conflict with your family's priorities, which is we, the family, crave stability. It's hard, right? It's really hard. And so for me, I was blessed to have been part of great organizations, to have had the opportunity to go to Air Command and Staff College and then later Air War College, where I could really invest in my own professional development. I had the opportunity to command a schoolhouse squadron at Tyndall Air Force Base at the formal training unit, the F-15 unit, at the 05 level. Then I had the opportunity to serve in a couple of great staff positions where I learned from some incredible leaders, not just Air Force, but across all the services as I worked in the joint environment. For me, what you're talking about really kind of came about the time I was a wing commander at Mountain Home Air Force Base, Idaho. Went out there as a colonel, and Kim and I looked at each other and said, okay, this might be the end of the road. In fact, it's well beyond where we ever thought we would be and where we thought we defined success when we were second lieutenants. You're right. Nobody wakes up on the day after getting their wings as a second lieutenant and says, I wonder when I'll get to be a general officer. No one should think that way, right? But as a wing commander at Mountain Home, I was in a position as a colonel. I was commander of an incredible and exceptional combat wing of 5,500 airmen who woke up every day trying to figure out how to go make the mission happen. And one of two things was going to happen coming out of there. I was either going to get promoted or I was not going to get promoted. If I didn't get promoted, that meant that after my wing command tour, I'd go back to staff probably as a colonel. If I did get promoted, it meant that I would probably leave the wing position and go on to a one-star job. And so that second thing happened. I was blessed to have great opportunities. But I hesitate to say it happened by accident because two things. Number one, I continued to invest in myself professionally to try to develop as much as I could while managing my family priorities. And number two, and this is much more important, any success I ever had was because of the incredible work of our airmen who worked with and for us, and was less about my personal achievements than it was about their performance and coming together as a team in whatever organization I was blessed to be in.
Mm-hmm. So, being part of an organization, especially in a leadership position, it kind of is almost a responsibility of an officer to create an environment where your enlisted personnel, whoever is serving under you, is
right.
comfortable and able to feel comfortable coming together in an environment like that. So how do you establish a culture within your unit or your squadron that makes that possible?
So you've really hit on something, which is we've got two big parts of our enterprise, of our structure, of our institution and organization. Right? We have the enlisted force, which is incredible and sets us apart from just about every other military in the world. Right? We empower our staff sergeants and tech sergeants, and quite often our senior airmen, and then master sergeants all the way up the chain, to go do things that other nations' air forces would only assign a captain or a major or a colonel to go do. Right? That is a propellant for our institution, the enlisted force. So that's part of it. The other side of it, you have an incredible officer force that is highly motivated, highly trained, quite often in the flying world now comes in with a technical level of expertise, is much more prepared to operate in the 21st century operating environment. And by that I mean, we have entrance to, and pick any operational part of our Air Force, the Space Force, they have grown up in a digital environment, right? So I often say I'm a digital immigrant in a world of digital natives, and that's just part of being a boomer. But the folks that are following us, my children's generation, and now your generation and those behind you, you work seamlessly in a digital environment. You are very comfortable in that, and that's important because that is part of the 21st century operational environment. To your point of and I do remember the original question, culturally, how do you as a leader create an environment where the youngest airman to the most senior, your operations officer, if you're a squadron commander, it's got to be from your youngest airman to your operations officer. How does everybody understand they're part of a cohesive team and that you care deeply? There's a lot of bumper stickers out there for leadership, right? Things like, your people won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Well, what does that really mean? What it means is you have to be visible and you have to be human, right? For me, I learned that primarily as a lieutenant colonel squadron commander at Tyndall Air Force Base of a fighter squadron when we still had operations and maintenance merged. And one of the ways I would do it is I would make it a point several times a week to leave my office and go out and walk on the flight line and talk to the crew chiefs. to stop and talk to the security forces airmen that were in the trucks watching the F-15s on the flight line, to sit and actually ask them, so tell me about your journey. How did you get in the Air Force? Where are you from? Who's at home that cares deeply about you? You have a spouse? Do you have children? Just having a conversation with someone and looking them in the eye. You know, we call, there's a number of things you call that, right? Part of it is leadership by walking around, right? But it also means you have to not just get out and do a loop on the flight line, you actually have to stop and talk to people. Without interrupting the airman who's trying to change an engine, right? You sit and talk to him and say, tell me a little bit about yourself. What's going on? You know, how do you think things are going, right? Asking somebody their opinion goes a long way, but then you have to actually listen to them and not just have a facade and a appearance of caring. You've got to actually care deeply. You'd be amazed when you have got 35 years in the Air Force, how many people come up to you in the after years and say, sir or ma'am, I was with you in Iraq in 2011. We were there together for that year. I was up in Kirkuk, or I was at Tikrit, or I was at Taji. You came and saw us, and this is what it meant to me. The other part is, as an officer, being involved in the person issues of your enlisted force, and not just always off railing that to the enlisted leaders, but while allowing them to do their job, right? The immediate supervisors and the intermediate supervisors. You also have to be understood to be involved in their lives. That means promotions. That means retirements. That means major inflections in their life, whether birth of a child or loss of a loved one, right? Those are the kind of things that get to that first bumper sticker, which is your people will do anything for you when they know how much you care.
Yes, sir. So another question I'd like to ask you is, over the course of your career, I'm sure that you have faced a moral dilemma, whether that was in your job or dealing with an individual person.
Right.
How did you, if you're willing to share, how did you overcome that moral dilemma?
Yeah, I saw that question when I did the read ahead, and I said, I hope she doesn't ask that one. Look, we live in a world where we're held accountable for our actions, right? And that's true. I didn't just learn that as the Air Force Inspector General in my 33rd year of service, right? And that's the other part. No second lieutenant wakes up the first morning after getting their wings and says either A, I hope I get to be a general officer, or B, I hope I get to be the Air Force Inspector General someday. It's a job that's incredibly important, but it's not one anybody ever wants because you do face some of these really, really hard questions, and a lot of them are tied up in the social issues that we face today, not just as an institution and as an enterprise, but across our entire society, right? I'll give you one that's a really, really tough one, right? I want to make sure I stay in bounds here. So let's say there's a commander, and this is where we come into some real competition, not conflict, but competition between the individual rights of our airmen, right, and the health and welfare of an organization, and the rights of individuals that work under a commander or leader, right? And I say that because we live in a world now with social issues coming to the forefront and actions that are put in place to protect the rights of all airmen, where some of these things are not aligned. For instance, religious beliefs and social issues that people that have very strong religious beliefs find in conflict with their religious beliefs, right? That's a lot of talk around to get to this. You have a commander who has very strong religious beliefs, and some of those are protected by congressional mandates, the right of our service members to practice their religion, right? Under that airman, you have, in this case, an airman who has a same-sex spouse, recognized, piece of paper, legal in the state they were married, right? That commander, because of his or her religious beliefs, refuses to sign a certificate of appreciation for the spouse of the same sex, of the retiring member of the military that has a same-sex spouse. That commander has signed a certificate of appreciation throughout his or her tenure for every other airman and their spouse who has retired. That commander is protected by congressional mandates to practice his or her religion and says, I can't sign in good faith that certificate of appreciation for that spouse because it's a same-sex spouse, and it would violate my religious beliefs because it means I recognize and endorse that individual as a legitimate spouse. You see how that comes in conflict?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now let's just say you're the next higher headquarters commander of that commander who says, you know what, I'm going to let my vice wing commander sign it. And that's going to be okay because it's still a colonel signing a certificate of appreciation for the same-sex spouse, right? That sounds like that's okay. Except what message does that send to the unit? That wing commander can't, because of his or her religious beliefs, treat that military member who has a same-sex spouse the same way that he or she treats all other airmen in the wing. So you see the dilemma there?
Yes, sir.
So now you're the next higher headquarters commander of that wing commander. What do? Do you tell that wing commander who will hold up the congressional mandate and it says I can practice my religion and I can't be punished for practicing my religion. On the other hand, you have a complaint from the retiring, still active duty, but retiring member of the military unit who says that commander's not treating me like every other commander, and I have a legitimate spouse, yes, same sex, but legitimate spouse, recognized by the Air Force as a dependent. So you see, and now you're in a really tough command position above this wing commander, because how do you protect the health and welfare of the unit while still honoring the rights of the individual commander? These are the really tough questions that from the time you leave the world of cadet and you become a second lieutenant until you become a colonel commander someday, these are the tough pragmatic questions that you're going to face. And so ultimately, what I will tell you, and guess what? I got to be that next higher headquarters commander, right, of that wing commander who said, I can't do that because it means I endorse or I recognize that marriage and my religion prevents me. I chose to suspend the command of that individual, and I only after deep legal consultation to make sure I was within my bounds, right? And the reason is because the health and welfare of the unit was going to be negatively affected by that individual. So all I would say to all of our rising commanders in the Air Force, you're going to have to think also as a commander about what you can and can't do as a commander within your legal and moral rights to make sure that you protect the rights of the individuals under you, but also the health and welfare of a unit, because you could have an unintended consequence, right? And it's really hard. It's like, as they would say back on the East Coast, it's wicked hard.
All right, so to bring the mood back up a little bit, because I'm sure that was a very heavy topic.
It was.
It is a very heavy topic.
And in fact, it's still out there, right? I mean, it was under review. It was appealed. It probably is the thing that'll never die. But it was a huge thought process and a learning process for me as a leader.
Mm-hmm. So while you were in Pakistan, you were you were the chief of the Office of Defense Representative.
Right.
If that's the correct term.
That is true.
What specifically is that role, and how might that differ from the role of a defense attaché?
Yeah, so the defense attaché is generally acknowledged to be part of the intelligence community, right? And it's led by a colonel in most countries. They are trained in diplomacy. They are trained in intelligence issues and techniques. And so they are recognized within our structure, just who they report up to, but also around the world by our partners and allies and other nations. They're recognized as part of the intelligence community. The chief of ODRP, right, the Office of Defense Representative Pakistan, it's a mouthful. You, in this case, were the CENTCOM commander, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense military representative to the military in Pakistan. So you were working two different lines of effort. One was operations. What were we doing within Pakistan that would enable our success in Afghanistan, largely? And then security cooperation. What kind of equipment, training, and education and other things were we selling to the Pakistanis through the Foreign Military Sales Program to make sure they were the strongest, most prepared allies that we could have in South Asia, a really, really tough neighborhood, right? So Chief ODRP had those two lines of effort that worked bifurcated from and parallel to the defense attaché. The Pakistani military recognized the chief ODRP as the guy or gal we could go to and that could help us get the stuff we need to win the war on terrorism. The attaché, we have to be more careful with him or her because that's really the intelligence side of doing things. So that's the easiest way. I've lost track of how they've worked the structure in ODRP now. I think that it's actually somewhat overlapping now with defense attaché and chief ODRP. That's what I think, not what I know. I was the last of the 3-star chief ODRP positions, and then they started to bring that down to dilute that to a 2-star, then I think a 1-star, and I think it's still a 1-star. That has strategic implications because the Pakistanis liked having a 3-star American there because they felt like you had the WASTA to help swing the vote their way and get things for them they needed. But it's just an evolution in our process. Initially, when the war on terrorism started way back in 2001, it was a much lower ranking officer there, and then it elevated through the years of Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the things we were doing in South Asia. Now it's kind of come back down and normalized. Pakistan's they are a critical but a very difficult and tough partner to work with. They are highly professional. They come from the British military system when in 47 the Raj split to India and Pakistan, and then South Pakistan, which now is Bangladesh. So it was a fascinating thing. The reason that they put a high level officer there, and it wasn't always Air Force, it was a joint position, so it was nominative and would go between the Army and the Navy. Actually had an admiral there for a while. The reason there was a 3-star there, and the CENTCOM commander at the time told me, hey, look, I got my hands full with Southwest Asia, Iraq. I've got my hands full with Afghanistan. I need you to take care of the Pakistan thing and call me if you need help, and I'll be there to help you with whatever you need. But that's why we put, Tony, that's why we put a 3-star there, is so I, as a CENTCOM commander, could focus on this other stuff and have you to go to when I needed help with Pakistan.
So when I originally read that in your bio, my first reaction wasn't actually to think of the war on terror. I thought of Kashmir, since it's a global hotspot.
Yeah.
While you were in that position, did you have any, I guess you would say, perspective, maybe not perspective, but an overview or an understanding, or even have to take action that might be associated with the conflict in Kashmir? Yeah,
much less so to the east and northeast than the west and southwest. And I say that because my primary focus, our primary focus in ODRP was, what do we do when we wake up every morning in Pakistan and Islamabad trying to do things right to make things better for the guys and gals in Afghanistan? The administered territories in the northwest of Pakistan were still troublesome with the Haqqani network. They were crossing the border into Afghanistan, making life difficult for the Afghan military and for some of our forces in Afghanistan. There were trouble spots down on the southwest corner of, the western border of Pakistan with regard to Iran, things you had to keep track of there. Pakistanis are a nuclear nation. Mm-hmm. Part of their doctrine is the use of tactical nuclear weapons, small nukes, right? They believe that it's escalate to de-escalate, right? And the reality is, in my personal opinion, not having served in Asia, I know that North Korea and South Korea, that's a dangerous neighborhood too. But as I look across the world and ask myself, where's the most likely exchange of nuclear weapons going to happen? It's less so in Putin following through on what people think are threats from him or from Kim in North Korea. It's less so from them than it is a miscalculation and escalation. Quite often could be tied to Kashmir and that disputed territory between the Pakistanis and the Indians. The Indians have got their hands full in their neighborhood. They've got a lot of different issues. China comes into play in this. Pakistanis and Chinese have a very deep relationship that quite often when our U.S.-Pakistani relationship cools, the Pakistanis ramp up their relationship with the Chinese because, number one, they're geographically close. Number two, historically, the Chinese have been willing to deal with the Pakistanis, maybe turn a blind eye towards things like nuclear development, nuclear weapons development. As far as intervention, part of my job was to be, I'll use the term, I'll kind of mix things up here, a bit of a military diplomat in that when the Pakistanis were doing things that made us grumpy from a policy perspective in the United States government and the Department of Defense, Department of State. First of all, Department of State, our diplomats there did great work, and I had 2 great ambassadors I worked for. But clearly the diplomatic lead was Department of State. But when it came to interacting with the Pakistani military, that's when it fell to me to go talk to the Pakistani 4-star, the Pakistani 3-star, and to try to say, okay, brother, why are you doing this? What are you doing? Then you would get the lecture about how dangerous a neighborhood it was, why the Indians were almost certain to invade Pakistan, and you'd have to kind of go along with them for the ride on that. And then at some point you had to kind of come back and express your perspective from the Department of Defense perspective of what Pakistan was risking by making choices they made. But they, again, live in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. And some of the decisions they make, viewed from a U.S. lens, it doesn't make sense to us, but we don't live in that neighborhood and have not had to suffer the many tragedies that Pakistan and Afghanistan have had to suffer through with regard to,
the war on terror.
The war on terror, terrorist attacks. Living in Islamabad on the embassy, I got to feel a little bit of it because I was not in the countryside, because I was not in Islamabad proper, I was fairly insulated. I was well protected, but you do get that sense just traveling around Islamabad of it's always a little bit tense.
So you mentioned that you worked for 2 different diplomats while you were in Pakistan. What is it like being at that high level in the organizational structure that you're directly working with civilians?
Yeah, it was awesome. So Ambassador Olson and then Ambassador Hale were the 2, and they were career diplomats. We have a number of ambassadors around the world that are political appointees, and they do great jobs too. But these were gentlemen who had grown up in the Department of State system and had been at every level of diplomacy and were now at that highest level, an equivalent to a DoD 4-star, right? To a 4-star general. Both of the individuals understood that Pakistan it's a different place, right? It's a place that you have to understand it's different for a number of reasons. The military exerts great influence on what the politicians do, right? I hesitate to say the military controls the politics, but they certainly influence it. There was a great book I read before I went over called Cross Swords. It's very deep history of the Pakistani military. It starts out and talks about, so I think the quote was, and I think I have it right, I think it's Cross Swords, it could be Military Inc., but the quote was basically, I'm paraphrasing, most countries have a military. In Pakistan, the military has a country, right? So you have to understand the influence the military exerts on the political system in Pakistan. Our ambassadors understood that. Our Department of State country team understood that. They understood if we didn't maintain a good relationship with the Pakistani military, that their diplomatic access would be extremely limited. And so the relationship between the chief ODRP and the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan, very close, and those ambassadors understand that military and then civil diplomatic relationship in the country team has got to be tight and has got to be integrated, or the diplomats can't get what they need, which is frankly supporting and pushing U.S. policy within a foreign nation, right? I mean, that's why we have ambassadors and country teams there, is to try to get our American policy advanced, right? Well, the importance in a country like Pakistan of saying, yeah, if you don't have good relationship with the Pakistani military, you're basically just here marking time because diplomatically you can't get anything done.
So we'll move in a little bit of a different direction, and that's towards promotion boards. And you, as a general officer, have met a number of promotion boards. So in your experience, and you've probably even been a part of some, in your experience, what are the attributes that an officer can have in their promotion package that make them eligible for promotion to high-level positions in the organizational structure?
Yeah.
Below-the-zone promotions, stratifications, et cetera, et cetera.
So stratification is always discussed. It's become the coin of the realm. But look, let's face it, only one person can be the number one person in my squadron of 100, or our squadron of 100, right? And so what does that mean if I'm number 2 or 3? Does that mean I'm dead in the water? No, it doesn't mean that, but only one person earns that highest stratification. But that, over the years, has become the go, no-go in a lot of people's minds of, well, okay, I might as well go be a civilian because you just told me I'm not going to get promoted. Therefore, I'm not going to have leadership opportunities, and I'm not going to have a quote-unquote successful career, whatever you define as success. The things that make, and the answer to your question is, much like weapons school, it depends. If you're talking about a promotion from captain to major, even major to lieutenant colonel, what do I need to see? What do we need to see? We need to see technical competency and expertise, right? Be the best technician you can. And it's often said, the most important job you can possibly have is the one you have right now, right? And it's true. While still understanding you need to prepare yourself and broaden yourself professionally so that when you have the next opportunity, you're in a position to succeed. Understanding you're not going to be as successful on day one of that assignment as you are on day 900 of that assignment, right? When you really learn what the assignment's all about and how to do the job. So early in the career, I would say being the best technician you possibly can. My experience, again, now 4 decades dated, right? But what that meant in my world was the first few years, you got to be the best operator in the airplane you could. If you're a finance officer, if you're a medical officer, that means being the best you can in the technician part of what you're doing. Understanding that in those jobs, quite often, you have a number of enlisted folks that are working, and they're the doers underneath you as you become a leader at a much earlier age than maybe our pilots do. And by leader, I'm talking about leader of a broad enterprise, not leader of a 4-ship. Okay, so for early promotions, having the best expertise, having the best endorsements of your technical expertise, things like if you get an opportunity to go to a training course, you get one option or one opportunity at it, right? So again, those of us who are biased to action, biased to achievement, we tend to be competitive, right? So why would I not want to be, if there's a distinguished graduate program in that course that I'm going to, why would I not want to do that? Am I just going to mark time and be TDY for 8 weeks? Or am I going to truly expand my knowledge professionally and my capability professionally? How is that recognized? Well, quite often it's by being in that highest portion of a graduating class assigned to your technical expertise, right? Now, break. Let's move into that major, lieutenant colonel. What kind of things, really does and should our force value? Broadening, right? You've now got the depth. Now show me the broadening of, have you gone and have you had the opportunity to work in the joint world? Mm-hmm. Because let's face it, and General Goldfein was big on this, and as is our current chief. General Brown, pushing forward in the joint world, building credibility, building relationships that you can then capitalize on years later. The relationships I formed as a major, working as an exercise planner at the Joint Warfighting Center, paid dividends when I was a colonel, paid dividends when I was a general, working with those same officers who I had established a relationship with that also moved forward in their services. So broadening with things like joint assignments, broadening and going to places that are less familiar to you, right? I left my job as a fighter pilot and went and learned how to be an exercise planner for high-powered staffs. I didn't know a lot about that, but I kind of learned it, and it broadened me. It broadened my capability. Interestingly, still in the training and education world, right? So here I was back in exercises. That's all part of training and conditioning staffs to succeed. So broadening there, broadening internationally. Having opportunities to, whether it's a fellowship and a short course, or whether it's a 10.5-month PME course, professional military education course. Not everybody gets that opportunity. If you get it, invest in yourself. You are supervising nobody for the year that you're a student. If you don't do everything you can to rebalance your life and make sure your priorities with your families and kind of re-blue and catch your breath, but also take that time to invest in yourself, those are the kind of things. So education, joint assignments, international assignments that are outside of your personal professional comfort zone and expertise. So depth first, right? Depth of expertise, and then breadth of exposure and achievement. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. So then on the flip side,
Mm-hmm.
What might stratification for promotion boards for enlisted personnel versus officers look like? There's different maybe not requirements, but expectations of both. So,
right.
So how do you go about writing, those stratifications for both groups?
So I'm going to caveat this with, I know both the enlisted promotion system and the officer promotion system is changing and has changed since I left 4 years ago. So my comments are going to be dated and fairly general when it comes to stratification. One of the things I will always remember is every year or so, it seemed like the chief of the Air Force Personnel Center, the commander of the Air Force Personnel Center, the chief of A1 would have, or the chief of the staff of the Air Force would have to author out a message saying, be specific in your stratifications, right? Don't say, top 10% of something. If you got to tell me what that is. Is it top 10% of this? Is it, if you say this person's the number 5 person in my squadron, great. Is that 5 of 7? You have a small squadron? Is that 5 of 500, right? So specificity is really important, hanging something on there so that the reader can gauge, right? I mean, so broad, nebulous, seemingly impressive stratifications are not helpful in the eyes of someone. You've got to kind of calibrate things for, at least when I sat on a promotion board, I had to have some calibration on it, right? Otherwise it became, okay, you didn't know exactly what to say that you could calibrate, so you said something that seemed impressive but might not be. And so if I have to ask, what's that really mean, you've already lost me. Does that help?
Yes, sir. All right, so we're running out of time, so we're going to wind down with some conclusionary questions.
Okay.
And one that I'd really like to hear about is what the highlight of your career for yourself was.
Yeah.
The assignment that maybe meant the most to you or had the greatest impact on you professionally or personally.
So again, the answer is it depends. From a personal satisfaction and family time and family, the value the family had in the assignment, our 2 years in Germany were awesome. We got to travel. We worked I worked with international partners. I was again back in the training environment, but now as a colonel, having done it as a major, I was in the exercise training and analysis world, working at Einsiedlerhof. Our children were old enough to, 2 of them were in high school, 1 of them was in middle school. They were old enough to really enjoy and understand and value what they were seeing in Europe. And so that was an incredible, from personal satisfaction and family satisfaction, that was a really valuable assignment and really a rewarding assignment for us. Look, I will tell you that every man or woman wants to go to their grave saying, I never had to kill another man or woman. But being in combat as a captain, and we left 1st Fighter Wing, I was in the 27th Fighter Squadron in the 1st Fighter Wing, and we deployed to to Saudi Arabia after the invasion of Kuwait. A week after the invasion, we were the first 2 squadrons, the 27th and the 71st, to go in. Being there for 7.5 months, having the workup time to get ready for combat, and then flying 33 combat missions in Desert Storm, first Desert Shield, then Desert Storm. That was professionally satisfying from a technical aspect, and the ability to go to combat as a squadron, form those relationships that still, here we are now, 30 years later, and I still am connected to the brothers and a few sisters that I was deployed with during Desert Storm. That is, I mean, how do you beat that? I mean, flying fighters in combat and coming back and being able to say, I was there, I was deployed, I made a difference. Technically, professionally rewarding. Squadron command at the 05 level, the fact that we had a squadron of about 350 folks, it was by today's standards in the fighter world, it was a big squadron because we bifurcated ops and maintenance. As an 05, for those who get to command at the 05 level, I'll tell you what my wing commander told me the day before he gave me the flag, and that is, enjoy your 05 command because it's the last time you'll truly command airmen. Mm-hmm. From here on out, if you command, you'll command other commanders. Mm-hmm. You'll always be one echelon removed from the airmen on the line. So enjoy that command. So that was rewarding for a number of reasons. In Panama City, Florida at Tyndall Air Force Base, commanding a fighter wing of 5,500 people that were all rowing the boat in the same direction. Well, almost all. Every now and then there was an airman who skipped the oar, but having, in Mountain Home, Idaho, having 5,500 folks on that team, being part of that team, hugely rewarding as an 06 command. And then I could go on and tell you for every one of my flag assignments what the valuable part of it was. But again, I go back to my previous assertion when we started, which I said 40 years of total time from the time I started college. But be careful, because 35 years will go by in an instant in your military career. And then you'll look back and somebody will ask you, what was the best assignment you had? And then you'll say, I'm going to talk you through every one of my assignments and tell you what the great things were about them.
Yes, sir. And then our final question for today will be about the legacy that you feel you've left behind in the Air Force.
So, what a great question for any airman who's dedicated 3.5 years or 35 years to our nation. I can't tell you the number of people that will come up to me in the oddest places, like in an airport in Dallas, walk into your gate, and they will stop you and say, hey, you're General Rock, you were Colonel Rock, you were our wing commander, you did this, this, or this. It just happened. Last week I was in Orlando, and a lieutenant colonel who I had promoted to colonel and went on to be a group commander in the Air Force and now is in industry, came up to me and talked to me about the promotion ceremony we did in the Pentagon and how much that meant to his family. So the legacy is the impact you have on airmen, right? I could talk about the legacy, that I left in any of the joint jobs I did, and whether I made a difference or not, and whether that difference still makes a difference today, because that's what defines legacy, right? Not what you did, but what you did and what it means today. But the fact that I have airmen, and sometimes soldiers, sailors, Marines, and hopefully someday Guardians, stop me and say, you did this for us or for me. Here's what it meant. And what I try to do every single time is take it away from the me, my, and I and turn it into we, ours, and yours, right? And so I try to roll that right back on them and talk about what difference they made in the unit and what difference their family made in sacrificing all those years. And try to make them understand it's a lot less about me than it is about us, right? But it's personally satisfying, it's professionally satisfying when somebody comes up and says, we were together at this location, and you did this, and here's what it meant to us or meant to me. There is no greater satisfaction. And so in some small way, I hope that I touch the lives for the better of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, and that will be my legacy going forward.
That's very nice, sir. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Lieutenant General Rock, thank you very much for making some time in your schedule to come out and be on our podcast.
Great.
And I suppose we will be seeing you this afternoon at Lead Lab.
Yeah, unless you go to sick call to get out ahead of me giving a presentation. But you'll hear some of the same things, hopefully not the same things. But I really appreciate the time. It's so great to be back here at UTSA and to see how the organization has grown, how the university has grown. Just a phenomenal recent past, a relatively short period of time, but what a boundless future UTSA and Det 842 has. It's really exciting to see.
Thank you, sir.
All right.